Hello, and I am very happy to welcome today Sarah Robinson to our cycle of conversations. Sarah Robinson is an architect whose practice is based in Pavia, Italy. She holds degrees in both philosophy and architecture and was the founding president of the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture Board of Trustees. Her books include Nesting, Body Dwelling Mind, Mind in Architecture, Neuroscience, Embodiment, and the Future of Design with Johanni Palasma, and Architecture is a Verb, forthcoming by Routledge in this year. She co-founded and edits the journal Intertwining and is adjunct professor in the Department of Architecture, Design, and Media Technology at Aalborg University in Denmark. And we are really glad to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, we have a very mixed group of students. We have students from architecture, from interior design, and also from urban design. And for all of them, it's the first time that they have a course which deals with these topics of the body and mind in architecture. And they have many questions for you. They are especially interested in hearing what you learned about the mirror neurons and how this connects to architecture. But we will leave that all for after your presentation. So I will share my screen.
So this book, which just came out at the beginning of the month, so it's really fresh, and so people are just beginning to read it, and I'm getting some feedback. It's interesting because when you write a book, you feel like it's such a well, you know, all the minds in your head, everything you've ever read, all comes together, and then you're alone and you create it, and then you wonder if it's sinking in or how people are, I don't know, and if it's making connections in other people's minds. Anyway, so this book is really, it's a fruit of many years of thinking about this since my first book, Nesting. When, you know, I think that was the first book to connect cognitive science and architecture together. And a little bit about my background. I first studied philosophy and then I went into architecture. So when there was and I had a busy practice, and then when there was a crash in like 2006, 2007 in California, I suddenly had this time on my hands and I started reading philosophy that I had left sort of on hold while I was practicing architecture. And I discovered all these wonderful new changes and breakthroughs that were being made by like people like Mark Johnson and George Lakoff and their work, Philosophy in the Flesh, which really was connecting how important our environment is to our being, to our culture, to our ideas, to our habits. Habitat comes from the word habit. And so from that, I wrote my first book, which was connecting cognitive science and architecture, because it seemed to me very relevant for architects. And then that led to organizing a symposium at Taliesin. I was the president of the board at the time, so I could do that. And I invited Johanni and Michael Arbib, who I think is here today, and Alberto, who wrote the preface for this book. And then, you know, Mind and Architecture came out of that. So this is really, for me, this was really a culmination of my thinking. And we can go to the next slide. And one of the mantras in this book is by Virginia Woolf, who I adore. Let us not take for granted that life exists more fully in that which is commonly thought big than in that which is commonly thought small. So as architects, we have big ideas, big plans. We think we're going to be making big buildings. You know, we start things we start thinking from the top down with our big concepts. And I think in that largeness, we lose sight of really the importance that our work has in shaping daily actions and habits. And so that's what this book is really about. So we can go to the next. And another inspiration for me was Dalmor Vesely, who his Architecture in the Age of Divided Representation has a really long title. But the heart of that book, that as I understood it, was what he wanted to create a situational or new poetics of architecture. So these are two really potent quotes from that book, which really became the basis of this book. The use of typical situations as primary vehicles of design is a new departure towards an approach that may be best described as situational or as a new poetics of architecture. That, coupled with the next one, restoring the practical nature of situation as a primary vehicle of design, enables us to move away from inconclusive play with abstract forms and functions. I mean, you could really call the last, how many years of architecture practice? 50 now, as inconclusive play with abstract forms and functions. It got completely out of hand. So his approach was restoring the practical nature of situations, but and he gives some suggestions in that particular book, but I found the idea immensely important, and I wanted to contribute to trying to find ways to restore the practical nature of situations, the actual activities of daily life, how we move, and how and in the action, in our actions, there's no division between mind, body, and situation. They all are together, fully present. And so I thought action is a way to approach design that doesn't separate mind and body and culture. They're all one. And so the book gives a lot of examples of instances, ways you can develop through human action. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, and part of that is rethinking, ourselves completely, and really as like independent bodies, because we don't come in independently, and we don't leave. I mean, we leave this life maybe independently, but we sure don't come in independently. We're all born from somebody else's body. And this fact that we're always sheltered from the very beginning is what makes architecture so very critical. And another thinker, architecture is a verb, talking about process and dynamism, the person who really added, he's called the process philosopher, was Alfred North Whitehead. And I thought this insight of his was really critical and could help us think about buildings that we create in a new way, it is the accepted doctrine in physical science that a living body is to be interpreted according to what is known of other sections of the physical universe. This is a sound axiom, but it's double-edged, for it carries with it the converse deduction that other sections of the universe are to be interpreted in accordance with what we know about the human body. What if we were to think of the rest of the world as we think of our bodies, as extended organisms? And, there's a lot of work being done on niche construction. And there's a really interesting thinker, his name is J. Scott Turner, who wrote a book called Extended Organisms. And he understands things like termites' nests as extensions of the bodies of the termites. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to go this, I want to keep this section part of it short. But one really interesting insight of his is that, when we create buildings that mimic termites' nests, we think of the termites' nest in this mechanical way of, bringing air in from the bottom and exhausting it from the top using sort of mechanical laws. But if you look at it from like a physiological point of view, like he did, it really functions like an extended lung. in the way, because some termites nests don't actually have openings to the outside. It's all internally recirculated air. And that's, anyway, that opens up a whole other world of not only metaphor, but science, thinking of our buildings as extended bodies. So we can go to the next. Oh, now, then, you know, if you've read anything I've written, you've probably seen a lot of Merleau-Ponty, because he's a huge inspiration for me. But now think of this way that he writes about his Paris flat. He says, my flat is for me not a set of closely associated images. It remains a familiar domain around me as I still have in my legs the main distances and directions involved, and as long as from my body intentional threads run out towards it. So now think about when you get up in the middle of the night and you need to go to get some water. You don't have to turn your lights on. You know where all your furniture is, and you go and do what you need to do, and then go back to bed again without any sort of, not much waking consciousness. And so I think that's kind of analogous to what he's saying here, is that our body maps out space at a level below our conscious awareness. Because if it didn't, we would spend all this effort trying to get around and trying to, navigate space. But we do it fluidly and so quickly. Anyway, we all are like so in our houses now that we probably know, we're probably can think about maybe our relationship with our spaces in a different way. We can go to the next one. Oh, these are, I couldn't resist putting these spider webs in here. These are spider webs made by these spiders that the artist Thomas Saraceno keeps. He has like 400 spiders, these orb weaving spiders. And this was an exhibit I was lucky enough to go to in Florence this summer. But, people who study spiders know that the spider web is an extension of the spider's body. The spider can feel vibrations at the outermost extension of her web. And so if you think back to what Merleau-Ponty just said, think about how this might be a different way of thinking about space, about how we interact with our environments through vibrations out at the outermost extent of our web, which is our habitat. So we can go to the next one. And now I'm getting to this. This is another phenomenologist who I discovered through the process. The importance of this guy, I'll get to at the end, but let me just read what he wrote. And he's a phenomenologist. He doesn't write about architecture. He's never written anything that I found on architecture, but look at how well he puts this. Phenomenologically speaking, the social space, the architectonics of the lived world, is not a distant reality or an opposing system, but an analog of our abilities. So he's understanding it as our physiology, as an extension of our physiology, a completion of our disabilities or weaknesses, an extension of our activities. At the core, and he wrote this in the 80s when nobody was really talking about this. At the corporeal level, it is not separate from who we are and what we can do. To speak metaphorically, we're in constant dialogue with our lived world. The latter is an intercorporeal world of abilities, tasks, mutual supports, and corporeal extensions. Such an environment can be either wholesome, supportive, completing, or disruptive, unsupportive, diminishing our abilities, or limiting our tasks. One thing is certain, it's our design and our power to compose it in harmony with our being. So I happened upon this philosopher because he's the English translator of Jan Gebser. So we can go to the next slide. So in a chance encounter, I was discussing these things I was having a discussion with a dancer who I met. And she told me about Jan Gebser, who wrote this book that I don't want to mess up the German pronunciation because I can't, but that's the German name of it in in English, it's called The Ever-Present Origin, but he wrote it in various editions from 1949 to 1953. And his main thesis was that human consciousness has gone through these, he didn't call it evolution, but he said mutations, and starting with archaic, magic, mythic, mental, and integral. And he was friends with all these, the European avant-garde, basically Picasso, Rilke, Siegfried Giedion was one of his students. And I've never really encountered him in architectural discourse besides Peter Blundell Jones wrote something about Jan Gebser in reference to the Berlin Philharmonic. But anyway, I was totally captivated by his theory, because he looked at the perceptual organs of each, say, structure of consciousness, as he put it. And the magic period, he said, was the main way that people perceived their world was through the ear, mythic through the mouth, mental through the eye, and integral, a reunification of the mind and body. But now thinkers like Marshall McLuhan had read Jan Gebser, and he wasn't translated into English until 1983. So anyway, I took his structures, and we can go to the next slide, and I created this taxonomy of interactions. So I looked at archaic, magical, mythical, mental, and integral, and then I correlated each of them with an action, like breathing, resisting, touching, resonating, dancing. And then each of those actions, I looked at different ways that architecture can engage design, not only architecture, but design in general can engage these actions to approach buildings not as objects, but as actions, but from the approach of the actions that they can afford. So, and then there are a bunch of examples, and that tiny little print that you can't see are other ways. So we can go to the next slide now. I'll give you some examples here. So now these are I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this word right, so forgive me. Mashrabia, these ways that they're like breeze fillets, we'd call them for us. But this example, now these are desert socioculture thermal devices so the first, the archaic structure of consciousness, I correlated with the skin. So there's all these things about the skin and breathing. And so I looked at buildings from the perspective of how they allow us to breathe. And if you look at desert cultures who, until air conditioning came along, they lived pretty well without it. And that's because of their incredibly sensitive use of these thermocultural devices, which weren't objects. These all were verbs. So for example, this shading device has openings that are, each opening and the way it's designed has to do with human perceptual limits. They have certain, you can see out the top part, but not the bottom. So it allows privacy. It allows in only a certain amount of air. And it also is turned inward because the early, because along with this, these ways of building, I call them thermocultural devices, because there was nothing independent. Like culture is interlocked so tightly with the climate in vernacular cultures, and we can learn so much from these technologies that were so sophisticated, and then but they were also very integrated, not only with life but with the other buildings around them, because the whole setup, all these devices were nested within one another. The buildings were turned inward, away from the street, because the street was full of dust and a lot of noise. So it created a whole different kind of family life that was around a courtyard with a fountain and et cetera, all these different kind of implications of being in a certain place, this place-based building that was, it can't be understood as a static, as anything static that we can take this out and put it somewhere else where it doesn't belong. Everything was integrated and grew out like slowly over time. Anyway, we can go to the next slide. Like these are some other examples. This is like right before everything shut down. I was lucky enough to go to Iran, and this image on the left is a dome in a bazaar that's full of junk. Like and then you look up and there's this beautiful, incredible claustra, which makes the circulation possible in this place. The same with the water well to the right. So that's one of the things I wrote about breathing. There's a lot of other stuff there. So we can go to the next. Oh, and then touching is a huge one. Now, this is a project of a student who came to a doctoral seminar we had in Aalborg that I was invited to. And this is her carpet, her urban carpet. And that is another example of how she engaged people in touching in an urban setting that I was inspired by. The middle images, these are hand sculptures. I also talk about the Bauhaus and their sensory training, how important that was. And so under Moholy Nagy, before they did anything else, they had to make these hand sculptures, which could only... The most important thing was not how they looked, but how they felt in the hand. So what happens is all these sculptures are also very visually pleasing as well. It's not just that, everything kind of analogous with what I just said about those desert thermocultural devices. Everything was integrated and it was beautiful. It worked. People, it enabled intimacy and closeness while allowing people to breathe. There was what was good for one was good for all. And this is in other dimensions, in other words. So vision alone is we keep talking about how we shouldn't just rely on vision, but how are we really going into depth about what that means? What does that really mean for designers and architects? So, and there's some good precedents out there, like the Bauhaus and their sensory training. And then the image on the right is the museum in China. Totally escaped, but made of all these just found building debris that now make up the skin of the museum. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, and then I really resonating. So the magical period was the period of the ear, and this is really fascinating because the ear is so close to our emotional sense. John Dewey said the ear is the emotional sense, because if you think about sound and how quickly emotions come from the sound. Sound conveys fear, happiness, and it's immediate and all sort of consuming. And so resonating was a fascinating study for me, because another chapter, which I didn't tell you about in the beginning, talked about the body and how we need to reconceive the body beyond, the visual, and a way to do that is also through sound. So I researched the resonant body, which Gernot Bohm, who's he's the atmospheres philosopher, he suggested this idea of the resonant body. And so what if we thought of buildings as resonant bodies? These are resonating plates on the left. And so if you resonate a metal plate with sand on it, the sand collects according to certain frequencies. And so the white areas are where, so each frequency has its own shape. The vibrations where they're still, they don't move, the sand can't move where it's still. And so each one of these shapes is a frequency of sound. So it's, again, all the senses are connected, and look at how beautiful this is. Another completely inspiring way resonance relates to architecture is, I don't know if you guys have read Murray Schafer. He invented the term soundscape, and his whole thing was that if you reinterpreted architectural history from the ear rather than through the eye, it would open out a new way of understanding architectural history. So now this ceiling, these are shapes of instruments. This is again in Iran, in Isfahan, and it's a room made for chamber music. And so what it is, it's an echoic chamber that absorbs echoes. So you have intimate, and it's a big space, but it doesn't sound big. It sounds very intimate. So this is where, the important person entertained their guests with chamber music. So again, beautiful, does its job, acting like a verb, resonating, absorbing echoes, perfectly suited to its purpose. We can go to the next slide. And now another amazing person I discovered is this, he's Austrian, his name's Bernhard Leitner. I don't know if you guys have run across his work, but he has been exploring sound since the 70s. So like he was inspired by the light artists, like James Turrell. And so while James Turrell was working with light, Bernhard Leitner's been working with sound, and he made this sound chair as an art object. And then it was later studied by the University of Bonn with people who were, before they had surgery, they found out they had better surgical outcomes. And through his experimentation, he's realized that, sound travels through the whole body. And so that, and he can direct sound in certain parts of the body. And according to him, different parts of the body are more sensitive to sound than others. Like, for example, he says his knee is more resonant than other parts of his body. And I was just going to go meet him, and then I couldn't leave the country. So that's still open, but he's getting, he's like 82 now. So I hope I can still go meet him. And another amazing project of his is on the next slide, which is in Paris. It's in the Parc de la Villette, which is hidden in this bamboo grove. And it's a sound cylinder, and you can hear it has water dripping at different frequencies inside of the cylinder. And so you basically feel your body resonating in this, what is more or less a musical instrument. So the next time you're in Paris, check this out. And then the next slide. Okay, you probably know about him. This is Yanis Xenakis. He was a composer, and he was an engineer, and he was also an architect. And he also wanted to engage, he wanted to, let's say, liberate sound from this dualistic relationship with the musicians on a stage and the audience passively sitting in the audience. So he had this idea to put the musicians to surround the audience, to immerse the audience with musicians. And that those little circles and everything are the sound that would envelop the people who are in this, in this performance. And in my poetic imagination, I imagine, I've been trying to think how one could depict parapersonal space, which you guys have probably talked about. It's a space that extends, beyond our body. It becomes important with tool use, but it's an envelope that our nervous system extends into. So I sort of thought, when a crowd of people are together, this is what all our space would look like, overlapping with one another. So we can go to the next slide. So another great trip I took was going to La Tourette in France, in Lyon, which anybody can go to. You guys should definitely go when you can. It's a monastery. The monks still live there, and you can stay in the cells. And it seems like something that would be really expensive. It was 30 euros and included 2 meals.
Oh.
So it was amazing. And I was there with 2 other people who were these, one was a landscape architect, and one was a Spanish artist and her husband, who are the most interesting people. And this space is amazing. I loved it, and I didn't think I would. I had sort of preconceived notions about it, and that was I realized how wrong I was. But so Yanis Xenakis, the musician composer, he collaborated. He was Le Corbusier's acknowledged collaborator on La Tourette, and the windows, this fenestration system he came up with. This is based on Le Corbusier's modular, which Xenakis also helped Le Corbusier with that, but it was based on the musical scale. And you can see, again, beautiful. It not only looks beautiful, it's based on this beautiful logic of music. So, and what Le Corbusier wanted, he wanted plate glass. He wanted concrete and huge sheets of plate glass, which were way too expensive for the monks, because the monks didn't have a very big budget. So it was all about, and they took vows of poverty. So, he wanted, Le Corbusier wanted to, he wanted to relate to the culture of the monks. So in order to do that, they had to make all these panes of glass, which were much less expensive. And the mullions are concrete. So cheap, gorgeous, and undulating glass. It was a breakthrough at the time. And look at all the texture. You don't think of Le Corbusier. Well, at least I didn't. I won't speak for others, I'll speak for myself. But there's this luscious texture in the building, and the floor, the concrete floor that you see, it has that same undulating pattern, the same musical pattern in the floor throughout. So we can go to the next. Again, okay, so this is the chapel, which has the feeling, the sound feeling, and the emotional feeling of being inside like a medieval cathedral, but in a totally modern way. And in fact, the reverberation time is the same as a medieval cathedral. So the way they pulled this off is through the light and the resonance of the space. And it's unlikely that Le Corbusier would have been able to do that without Yanis Xenakis, whose expertise made this the masterpiece it is. So we can go to the next. Okay, so I think you know a lot about dance, right? And talk about dance. So dancing is one of the verbs that I have in my taxonomy of interactions. And I just briefly touched about these eurythmic classes with Jacques Delcroix at Hellerau. And it turns out that through the scholarship of Harry Francis Mulgrave, we know that Le Corbusier's brother was a piano teacher at Hellerau, and Le Corbusier was a student there. And another thing to notice and pay attention, when you go to La Tourette, because you have to go, is the movement, the famous promenade that of Le Corbusier. It completely prepares you for the experience and is totally isomorphic with the emotional effect he wanted to have. And another interesting thing I learned about Le Corbusier after, and just writing and thinking about resonance, is that Le Corbusier, this is there's amazing things you can find on the internet, but one is these old talks of Marshall McLuhan, and there's this Marshall McLuhan saying that according to Le Corbusier, the best way to experience a building is at night with all the lights off. And I thought that's very interesting coming from somebody who is allegedly completely a visual architect. Anyway, then I maybe suggested that his training at Hellerau had something to do with his sensitivity to the of movement, definitely, as I experienced La Tourette, but maybe the promenade in general. So we can go to the next slide. And you probably know about this too, related to dance, but in Steinhaler Rasmussen's masterpiece, Experiencing Architecture, he writes, we can see, these are the Spanish steps in Rome, we can see a petrification of a dancing rhythm of a period of gallantry. It gives us an inkling of something that was, something our generation will never know. So if you think, again, when you're in Rome and think of the Spanish steps, according to Rasmussen, the steps are designed for the Polonaise, the movements of the Polonaise, because the people at that time weren't big walkers. Let us say the promenade, the dance, the Polonaise, the Baroque waltz were the movements that they were used to, and so he speculates that the Spanish steps were a concretization of those movements, which is very interesting. So we can go to the next slide. And speaking of dance and movement, this is the Portland open space designed by Lawrence Halprin, who's a landscape architect, but his wife was a very important dancer, Anna Halprin. I wrote about her in the book. And she was into situational dance. So that's really situated poetics from both of them. She created dances based on the place. So the place inspired the dance and vice versa. So it was this reciprocal action. And this place, these public fountains are in the middle of a city center, and you'd never know they were there. They're sort of like Bernard Leitner's sound cylinder, tucked away behind trees where nobody can notice them. And then there's this whole world that opens out. And so then there's another slide. And so people, I don't know if they're able to do this anymore because it looks really dangerous, but like back in the day, that's a city center, and people would, swim and dance and play and frolic in the water and in this, how could you call that inert? It's completely alive. So then there's just one more slide. And anyone who's ever written anything I've written you've probably heard a lot about John Dewey, because he's another one of my favorites. He's like one of the original philosophers of embodiment. But he said there's something tucked away in something that he wrote. He wrote for a bunch of doctors in Chicago. And at the end of this talk, it was about the problem between the mind and the body being separated. And this is one thing he said in that talk, which is so true. The more human mankind becomes, or humankind becomes, the more civilized it is, the less there is some behavior which is merely physical and some other purely mental. So true is this statement that we may use the amount of distance that separates them in our society as a test of the lack of human development in that community. So think about that. Think about the great art, great cuisines of the world, you know, there's a complete fusion between mind and body. The act of eating is almost sacralized in Italy, for example, where I live. I mean, eating is sacred. Eating is, it brings people together. It's, you know, celebration of life. All the ritual around it is huge. And so the more culture develop, the more mind and body are fused over time. And I think that's a if there's a yardstick for measuring like a test for the development of human development, I think that's a good one. So that's a conclusion of a little taste of what the book's about, because it's actually, Juhani told me it was dense. Well, actually, so did Harry Mulgrave. So I think maybe I like to think of it as more thick. It's not a chart with, it's not an outline. It's actually pretty dense, the book. So I'd love to hear your questions about it.
Yes, I feel now after your wonderful talk a little bit like I felt with the book, that I would need so much time and so many forest walks to let all these threads sediment, and then questions come. Also, I think because we meet as class before each conversation, and it's a very nice serendipity, because most of the questions that our students had today, I think that they were somehow addressed during your talk. So especially when you spoke about the ear, we have this practical component in the seminar, which is very influenced by my work as a performance artist, that works directly with the body. So in some of the exercises are to respond to the environment with movement, responding to objects. Sometimes I also work with reacting to sound. And one of the exercises is focused on each of the senses. So for example, taking a walk and responding to the environment, paying attention only to what you hear, and then only to what you see, and then only to what you smell, to the sensation of the wind in the skin, and so on. And we had many interesting questions that came here. And actually, I would be hoping that they would come again, because I think, Justus, you were talking about the ear, maybe.
Yeah, so thanks again for the talk. I think it was great for me to see those, or the connection between all the senses, because I tried to do those exercises separated from each other. So I tried to focus only on the hearing, only on the visual, only on the feeling, and so on. And it was extremely hard, especially in an urban area, just to close your eyes and focus only on what you're listening to or what you're hearing, because you can't just walk down a street with closed eyes in a crowded city. And probably this was the point when I realized, even when I went to streets which were not that busy, how strong our senses are connected, and we can't deal without any of it, or we can't. It's extremely hard, especially the example you given about the touching device from Bauhaus. I think it's so great because, as you said, it lies perfectly in your hand. It's just pleasing, and also from your vision. And I think it's extremely great to see that it's so strongly connected. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, another really interesting thing that was somehow threaded into your talk, and also how your book starts, that you mentioned your personal experience of growing up very close to the woods and being in the woods all day and then going back home, and how you felt that in your experiences being more and more in the outside world, that you were confronted with your experience of freedom being restricted by the built environment that we usually have, and by the and you were, because of this feeling of perhaps confinement, that you became very aware in your own body of the need to build spaces and to build an environment that have this kind of porosity that you just mentioned before in your talk, and you showed these wonderful facades that we see that they breathe. So this feeling of a breathing also as a living organism that doesn't make us feel suffocated or smothered, not like a possessive womb, but something that nurtures and at the same time allows our physical and also mental expansion simultaneously without separation.
Well, another thing I said was that, you know, and this is really true, I hated being in buildings so much. And then I went to live in Taliesin. I live in Taliesin West and Taliesin in Spring Green. And I felt for the first time in my life that I could stay inside, and I would actually love to stay inside. Mm. And the reason, and you know, the book really is all inspired, is so inspired by those buildings. If you don't, I mean, they're verbs, they're alive, they're so alive. They're live with me when I'm designing still. But they don't speak language, they speak something below language, something deeper, something in the body that's primitive almost. And that's why, to me, you know, comparing architecture to reading or languages is actually cutting it short, because there's this world of, you know, the body that's so much more full of, you know, just richness and information and knowledge, really deep knowledge. And that's, you know, and so those buildings were porous. They gave a sense of shelter and a sense of prospect at the same time. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So there was this dynamic sense of being in them. Like when you're outside, you know, you feel there's always this dynamism. And so it's both calm and freeing. Exactly. In the same moment. And you can have both at once. And that's what makes it this incredible. It's possible, you know, it doesn't happen very much.
But it's also very, very alerting, because, for example, I experienced so many buildings, and especially in Germany. I come from Portugal, but I live in Germany since almost 8 years. And there is a kind of standardized idea of comfort, and I think it comes from the 50s, which expresses itself in spaces which are very preset in terms of affordances, which have all the commodities, you would say, that make a space comfortable. So you can make it very warm, and you have windows that seal everything from the outside, etc., etc. And I always have a feeling of very intense claustrophobia around this idea of comfort, because it's a kind of comfort that detaches us from nature, and that also somehow saps our resilience. In Portugal, we have in our building culture something called the breathing of the wall, that there should all, because we have a climate which sometimes is very moist in many regions. And there's always, and you feel it, for example, in the architecture of Caesar, you feel that the wall breathes. There's always a little bit of air. And this is somehow something that you feel it with your body and with your skin, that you can have a lecture or be in a room with a group of people for a certain amount of time, and that space doesn't feel oppressive, because there's a kind of, always a kind of movement in the masses of air. And I think that maybe this is something that doesn't happen in every culture, or it depends also on the traditions. But I think I felt a very strong resonance with what you mentioned about this importance of having spaces that are both nourishing and give this feeling of freedom and of opportunity.
Well, I mean, breathing walls is again a brilliant vernacular solution that's no longer used. I mean, now you basically seal up, buildings are hermetically sealed they're like dead boxes on life support.
Yeah.
And that is not an exaggeration.
Hi, this is Eve. I wanted to firstly commend your presentation, Sarah. Listening to you is as musical as great movement to drive the inspiration of your vision and perception of these works. And as you know, I started in neuroscience as a hearing scientist. And so what always comes to me in listening and thinking about and experiencing our buildings is that, you know, the primary perception is of our visual sense is where most of us are trained in architecture. And yet the mystery and wonder of the relationship of the senses is underwritten when you look at the brain. The interconnection from the unconscious to the subconscious, all the way to the conscious, demonstrates form and function, demonstrates the interconnection of all of our senses. And so it becomes no surprise that we feel these things differently when we're in different spaces. And in hearing science, we actually use certain frequencies that we know are at the border of vibrating the body. We know the range of sound that vibrates the ear for human perception and for a sensitization to human voice. And we also know when you go outside of that range, that's when parts of your body not only vibrate, because everything vibrates when it's impacted by movement, but when that vibration becomes consciously perceptible and when it remains subconscious or unconscious. So these interactions can go on in the body as we experience architecture without us actually realizing it. And with that neuroscience in hand, we can actually design around what we already know from science. And one of the things that always strikes me is, you know, we talk about the phenomenology and the mind being separate to the brain, etc. And a lot of that is based on René Descartes' philosophy of a separateness of mind and brain. But I think we have to remind ourselves that he lived from 1596 to 1650. And so much of our understanding of the brain and the body and the mind has been added to since that time with technologies to understand these interrelationships in a way that we were never able to do in the 1600s. And so to keep our wonder and amazement in that era of saying it's a black box, we don't look inside, which is what the early psychologists of our contemporary era did. It's don't look inside the black box. It's an input, output. Don't worry about the black box. To now, when we have the most incredible tools to watch the brain in action in a healthy individual, or to record its microscopic and microsecond reactions, that's where I think our opportunity, not only to understand why we respond, but how we can use those responses to inform and guide design that creates an impact.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And I'm not, you know, I agree. I just have to say my hesitation is that I wonder how we can go from that to, okay, so think about the example of the hand sculpture, how what is beautiful to touch is also beautiful to vision. And what is beautiful to the ear is also beautiful to vision. How this, you know, how we experience this wholeness of design that comes from, I think, a whole body kind of knowledge that the designer develops,
Mhm.
which is
And-
not, you know, which is can be informed and I think sensitized
Yes.
by our knowledge of neuroscience, but I still, you know, question and haven't seen yet how the details of neuroscience, you know, as important as they are, can shape design.
Mm. I hear what you're saying, and I think our knowledge of the brain and how it impacts our behavior and our mental attitudes in our body is still in the realm of the not completely known. So there's still going to be gaps. For me, what the knowledge does is it sort of sets a boundary on my palette. If you imagine a palette of colors, and I know that if I've got that blob of black paint in the upper left, if I put my paintbrush close to that blob of black, or if I combine too many colors, I'm going to get brown and then I'm going to get mud. And so what it does is, with what we know of neuroscience so far, is here's the boundary of what we know. And if we go beyond it, we're very likely to have different impacts. So your example of what's beautiful in the hand, why is it beautiful to the eye? And some of that is beyond our current knowledge, but there are other parts of it that are within our knowledge. So for example, with sound, we know that if you go a certain decibel of loudness, you reach pain threshold.
Yes.
And if you go a certain level of quietness, it's not perceptible, and that changes for every frequency.
Yes.
So with that knowledge, we can say, all right, I'm designing a space for a beautiful resonant sound. Okay, I know the physics of resonance, and I know how it differs with frequency, and I know when it reaches either pain or perception. And so all that does is it doesn't tell you how to design, but it gives you a palette and some parameters to work with so that you can more readily move towards what you're trying to achieve. So if I'm designing a space for voice, it's very different to designing a space for music. And so it can move me towards the geometries that accentuate certain things. And so I don't think it's an all explanatory, but I think there are tools that help us to move towards some of the richness that we're seeking.
Well, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right.
It takes a team. Both science and architecture are team sports, I think.
Yes, I think so too. I think so too. And, you know, related to that, you know, the examples that I showed, you know, are okay, Le Corbusier. Okay, on the team, Le Corbusier's masterpiece, La Tourette, was a team project.
Right.
I mean, that could be an analogy. I mean, you had somebody who was a mathematician, like in one body, you had somebody who was a mathematician, a composer, and an engineer. And then you had, you know, Le Corbusier, who was already, you know, a painter, a sculptor, architect. You know, so together, they made, you know, a masterpiece together, which neither of them could have done apart. So maybe that's a model relationship.
Interesting.
Sarah, I also found it really interesting in your talk that you showed this image with the vibrating plates and how we can really understand that if we make this analogy to our own bodies and how we can perceive that our bodies are also resonating fields, mediums, that can completely change our perception of architecture. I mean, we know this through the way that we respond to music. For example, we know that some people like classical music, other rock music, or many people have big ranges of taste, we call taste in music. But what's really interesting is to see the direct effect and the resonance that these things have. But also at the same time, I think that also now in connection to what Eve was saying, and this is also always where I have a lot of questions about neuroscience, because people are not equal resonating plates. We are also different. We respond so differently to everything, and also to sound. So what for me can be a very pleasant sound, for example, I love progressive rock, for another person might be extremely boring and at sometimes completely overwhelming. And we can also make this transposition also for certain aspects of design. There are people who love to be in quiet, introverted spaces that are not very activating. And there are people who love to go to festivals and be surrounded by lots of people and with a lot of activities going on, and also aspects of culture. So how can we, in your opinion, how can we approach this possibility we have of actually addressing the body as a resonance medium with all the possibilities of design?
Well, I think one is, so there's a chapter of the book that's dedicated to the body, you know, and trying to suggest a new model for the body that's the resonant body instead of think about, even if we're not strictly speaking about sound, but you know, I mean, our brain makes waves that we measure, you know, our nervous system does not end at our skin. I mean, the model, the body is this static, you know, object among objects that can be measured, is kind of the only one out there I've seen developed. You know, we have Le Corbusier's modular, which was a 6 foot tall man, arbitrarily chosen, you know. And I go into some detail about how that came about and what the limitations of that are. But I think even thinking about, as Eve was saying earlier, you know, there's a certain range of comfort, and it doesn't have to be the comfort of, you know, the stodgy comfort that you feel trapped by, but there's a range of comfort that going outside of certain limits, we exceed human, you know, we start to damage ourselves, right? So like, you can't live all the time at a music festival. Like, that's a festival because it happens periodically, yes, rhythmically, seasonally, you know, change and novelty. You know, what I sort of concluded in the chapter on the body was that, you know, in looking for universals, the only universal I could find was the fact that we're plastic and open, and we change according to our environment, you know. And and another way I think we can look at it is through the natural history of consciousness. I mean, so much of, you know, which is why I found Gebser to be a really fascinating, you know, his book's this thick and so amazing, but his insights into how when we emphasize vision, we start seeing according to that atrophied view, because our other senses literally atrophy and we stop noticing things, you know. So I mean, the plastic part, that we are plastic to a point, you know.
Right. Yeah, but it can always be reactivated. For example, I had to think about when you show this image of Xenakis with all the orchestra surrounding the people. For me, it was like a drawing of taking a walk in the forest and listening to all the birds. And the more you do it, if you pay attention, the more you understand all those things that are happening. And how when you hear the woodpecker, this vibrancy of the woodpecker on the tree, that you feel it almost in your body, that resonance is almost there. It's something that perhaps has to do with the mirror neurons, but also how these frequencies are transmitted in space and how your body reacts to them.
So Maria, I think you're pointing to another point about the nervous system. It's not just that neuroscience can give us these general rules, as Sarah referred to, but it also is tuned. And so we can tune our sensitivity to certain things consciously, as you mentioned, but the system is also tuned unconsciously and subconsciously.
Mhm.
And so certain perspectives, certain sounds, certain proprioception, touch underfoot, we are tuned naturally to be sensitive to certain things. And so we can also play with that and use that as we design. So knowing where those tuned moments are helps us to think about how to get the greatest reaction of a certain sensory item.
Eve, and what's also interesting about hearing is that we don't have earlids. We can turn it off.
We do when we sleep. We turn it down when we sleep.
But there's always some level of information which is processed. It's never completely completely gone.
But that range of paying attention and not paying attention to the sound, so from the range of sleep all the way to I'm focused, I'm attentive, I really want to hear and understand that speech because I don't speak Italian fluently, and so I'm listening very hard. So that's that range of tuning also. So architecture can walk you to that point of attention so that now you're focusing and tuning yourself to listen more carefully or experience differently.
And sometimes this awareness of the importance of sound is also heightened when one loses it. I saw recently a film called The Sound of Metal, and it's on Netflix, and it's a really interesting film about a young man who has a band, a heavy metal band, and he suddenly loses his hearing, and we see there's a whole development of the emotional reaction of the character to the situation and so on. But there's many interesting scenes where we see how his perception of space and also his feeling of being more or less connected to space and to people develops. So if anyone would like to continue with this discussion, I would definitely recommend. There's a question also from Milton Schinberg, please.
So two things. First is that there's a wonderful landscape of art and museum of art called Glenstone here in Washington, D.C., which has in its forest, one of its forest areas, dozens of speakers. And you walk through the space. There is a central space where the sound is focused and different kinds of sounds are projected as well as music. It's quite good. But my question really has to do, for Sarah, has to do with the relationship between intuition and research for design, because I think both reach into the subconscious, trying to find the truth. And I'm curious about intuition. I think the more we know through science, the better. It helps solidify what we're doing as designers, as architects. And architectural intuition also plays a big part in that. It's informed by experience. And then there's speculation, which is informed by intuition and experience. And I think the speculation, I'd like your comment on whether this kind of speculation is intuitive and experience-based, how to promote hypotheses for research from those foundations.
Well, that's an excellent question. It's a lot. You asked many layers of things there in that one question, but I'll just speak about my own process, which is highly intuitive and draws a lot on experience because, I think everybody has their own sort of, it's hard to be someone you're not. And so if you naturally are good at math, you do math, and I'm not. So my natural way is embodied in this book, which is very synthetic, very experienced, and pretty intuitive, and does speculate based on those intuitions, which a lot of people probably wouldn't do, but I take the chance to speculate. So I think, you know, I think there's I don't know. I don't actually know how to answer that question, because I think sort of building on what Eve said earlier, you know, what you direct your attention to is often what you notice. And so if there's an area of concern that we have, we are going to notice things, our attention sort of gathers around itself. It sort of acts to attract, you know, our attention. There's so much going on in the world at any one time that our attention is always, of course, selective. But what we pay attention to, we start noticing around us. You know, all of a sudden, if you start thinking about sound, you're going to start hearing more sounds, because of that layer of reality, of the thick reality that exists, your consciousness is tuned into. So in that sense, I think intuition, it sort of opens out worlds to you based on how much attention you give it. You know, you start noticing things that may have been there all along, but all of a sudden you notice them because you changed your attention, and your attention was attuned, like literally attuned to that. I don't know how you'd say, like, frequency of reality in that moment. And I think that's what can really change and attune people's experience when it comes to design, is if you emphasize what they're paying attention to. You're creating you know, as an architect, you're creating their perceptual world. You are, you know, you don't like it's as Merleau-Ponty said, you don't see the art, you see according to the art. I mean, like in a Frank Lloyd Wright building, I was starting to see according to the buildings. They were patterning my consciousness in what I noticed. And so that changed who I was. So that is why I'm interested in what I'm interested in, because it goes back to that experience, which again was, you know, communicating to me in a very deep way.
Transformative.
Yeah.
In a transformative way.
So I experienced that transformation, and that made me want to learn more about how we might do that, how we could make that happen. Just the importance and the possibility, and how really, you know, buildings are not something you walk in and out of. Even the bad ones, they're shaping your consciousness, whether you want to or not. This happens. This is who we're creatures who are open perceiving, and our attention is reciprocal. What's going out is also coming in and shaping our world.
Struck by how attending to things also creates memory. And what you attend to, in the case of my students, for example, I ask them to use architectural drawing techniques to represent what they remember of a space they're not in, that they are familiar with. And what they come up with is highly varied. What they attend to is quite different. And then I tell them that whatever they've drawn is 100% accurate, because it's the reflection of what has distilled into memory from attention.
That's a great exercise.
I have a similar experience that underlines what you were saying. I did my architecture degree after my PhD in work in neuroscience and clinical neuro. And I was driving along the same road that I'd driven along for 10 years. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, a building that I had passed regularly, I all of a sudden said, oh, that's of the so-and-so era, and was just from a few microseconds, from a quick perception, able to identify the shapes and forms of that building that I had never attended to before. And so just the act of going through an architecture and design degree was training my mind to see buildings differently and to think about them differently, And then all of that change of my perception then led into, and I struggle, like Milton was suggesting, the difference between what is experience, what is intuition, and what sits in between. But that training, that change in perception, and that experience of learning also drove what I did with my hand and my pen as I was designing and thinking about whether this shape might fit better with another shape. So it's a very interesting transformation about how we consciously think about architecture and how we unconsciously think about architecture.
I would just pick up on these thoughts that you've shared now, and also from Milton. And what I'm trying to do with the seminar, and I think that our students are also tuning to this, is exactly to try to pick up this Bauhaus tradition of working with the body and doing these exercises that focus exactly on the multisensory experience. So not just seeing vision and hearing and touching as separate things, but things which are interconnected. There's this wonderful line, I think it's from Merleau-Ponty, that says, the eyes want to touch and the hands want to see. And I always have to think about cubism when I think about this line, because, and you also mentioned, Sarah, the avant-garde in your presentation, and how we had this avant-garde at the beginning of the 20th century, and even the Portuguese modernists, for example, we had Fernando Pessoa, and he wrote these poems that were really trying to create a kind of a synthesis of sensorial experience connected to memory and to the sound of the word, and also to the effect of the rhythm of the word in the mind and in the body. And I think that at some point in the teaching of architecture, this kind of, there was a big disconnection between the artistic side of architecture practice, and we somehow forgot about the body. We left it behind. So what I try to do with my research is really to use performance in this really embodied and in this sense very practical way to bring back again this focus, because as we work more and more digitally, our range of motion is so confined. We are limiting ourselves. We are not exploring the full range of, for example, our arm space and so on when we draw, because we are always in this narrow, very confined environment that for now the digital tools give us. And I think it's really important that we bring the material and that we bring these things together.
I have also another question or something I'd like to join. We talked about how we can become attuned to the situation by architecture, but I'm also wondering how we could learn to become attuned to our body and how we move and use the space. Because at the beginning of the talk, you were also saying that the architecture shapes our daily habits and actions and is so situational. And it also is this shelter we have, but can also become a cell or something very restrictional. But what I was experiencing in the past years also was that at some point I was understanding how I was using the space according to the different states I was in, and then could see, okay, how limited can be a space or how much potential it can have to shelter all the different needs I have in that moment to pull myself away or to engage with people. And for me, I have two questions, is that how can we inform ourselves what are good habits and actions that we want to enhance, and also how we can all become more aware of our surroundings and how it impacts us, but also how we have the option to sort of change the interaction and connection we create with this space?
Well, I think, like, again, drawing on my own experience is, you know, one of the best things I ever did was I practiced Zen meditation, and for a while pretty seriously. And I did this retreat. It was a week of silence. It was silence, and you ate in silence, and everything was highly ritualized. And after that week, you're kind of training your consciousness. Meditation is, and it makes you more aware. It helps you direct your attention, because what the Zen master says is, like, the monkey mind is always going off and thinking of things, and you have to always bring it back to the breath. Like, the breath is the thing. So you basically are training your mind to follow your breath. And so when you feel, you know, in moments of crisis or tragedy, or you have this capacity to follow your breath and, like, literally not lose your mind. But I think that, you know, that teaching comes from, like, these traditions of where breathing is important. They also have amazing aesthetic traditions. Like, think of, you know, the whole culture around Zen Buddhism is very minimalist but gorgeous. The whole retreat I went on was every detail was picked with immense care and beauty. And so, again, back to the sort of what's good for one sense is good for all the sense. Like, good for training your mind is opening worlds to your awareness, is opening, you know, because there are levels of refinement that are infinite, you know, to human attention, because you're never getting everything. So I mean, that's from my own experience. And it's not just mine. I mean, many people, you know, meditate. Whole entire religions are based on meditation. It's not a religion. It's more like a practice, a body-mind practice. But I think, you know, that body awareness is maybe one of the most important things in becoming an architect. Like, that is a complete speculation on my part to say that Le Corbusier's training at Hellerau, his musical and dance training, which sensitized him to movement in space, may have maybe that had something to do with his promenade. But he was a master of movement through space, and he got that way by training his own attention, training his own sensory perception.
But I learned from my thesis advisor, PhD thesis advisor, Duarte Cabral de Melo, that Le Corbusier he had very bad eyesight. And Duarte knew about this because he was also blind from one eye. And people who have not complete blindness, but also partial, not only complete blindness, but also partial blindness, move very, very slowly and have very deep awareness of movement in space, because they rely so much on the feeling of space in the body and also on what the feet are feeling. But he was also a painter. So he was also, with the poor eyesight he had, very tuned to color. And I think that this could explain also, besides the influence of Hellerau, of course, a lot of his awareness.
And Michael Graves similarly had poor eyesight, so he had poor eye alignment, and so depth perception would have been a challenge. And when you look at his work, his mastery of creating a two-dimensional plane from a three-dimensional building, I think is part of what he was able to do. I think on a very practical note, there was another point I wanted to make. As we move to digital design, and as they stopped bringing the scale that we all had to draw at the bottom of our drawings, it was another chink in the armor that stopped us from thinking about how we fit inside of the spaces that we are drawing on a floor plan. And so rarely do we see humans moving their bodies illustrated inside of our plans. So it's very easy to forget how much space we take if we do outstretch our arms or step away from our desk and behind another chair. And when we look at our office environments, our open offices, where, you know, it's all about the price per square meter, we forget that every time you push past a colleague in such an environment, you disrupt them, you make a sound that isn't diminished because it's right next to the other person, that you can't hear yourself think. And so this lack of scale as we draw, particularly digitally, because we're not using our own rulers to set a sense of scale, is, I think, a problem in a digital design world that we can overcome. We just have to remember to overcome it.
That's a really good point. Are there other questions?
I think our students are processing all these all these thoughts we had. I found it also interesting that you mentioned your practice of Zen meditation, because since some time I started to practice I'm not really a dancer. I have to make this kind of clear. I'm not trained as a dancer. I'm a performance artist. But in the last month, I actually started to do a training in Butoh. I don't know if you heard about Butoh.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it really works exactly with these very, very slow movements. And it has exactly the intention. There's a kind of protocol of exercises that you should do to learn it. And one of them is, for example, the birth exercise, that you kind of regress with your body to the state of being in the womb, and you enact this feeling of being embodied there and then escaping, and then the whole process of getting to learn your body by the contact with the floor, and you kind of re-experience all this frustration of how hard it is to actually be able to first start using your arms and then using your legs and so on. And it's a really, really interesting practice, because you also understand how you wrote exactly in your book, and how you mentioned in your presentation, how dependent we are from these restrictions of space to actually get an awareness of our body. We need the floor, and we need the resistance of the floor to develop our muscles, so it's exactly through this contact that you develop this awareness. And there's really practices like this that invite you to suspend your thinking mind, the monkeys that are always running around, like you mentioned, and that really connect you to the breath, and also to this kind of, and this is the main goal of Butoh as a practice, that you somehow get aware of all these protocols and all these conditionings that we learn also through movement. And that we somehow, and this is the metaphysical goal, that we arrive at the original dance, which is always a personal thing. It's something that each person is born within. And I just find it also as a very interesting process, because in somehow it's a kind of learning through unlearning everything that we learned before, to get to this state of very playful and almost childish curiosity towards everything that surrounds us. I had to think about it because of what you mentioned also.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful practice.
But I can recommend you. There will be in the fall again another workshop, and you can start it with Marko Nektan. He's in Serbia at the moment, and I'm also doing this now simultaneously, and it's really interesting. And I think it has many good things to bring to architecture and to design in general. Alvaro, there's a question. You don't have sound, Alvaro. We can't hear you.
Oh, fine. So first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's amazing. I've read your book also. Well, nested by is, well, it was wonderful. I just wanted to say 2 words about your work that actually made me think about how I should approach architecture here in Peru, because I'm Peruvian. So 2 words, presence and atmosphere.
Yes.
So when you were talking about meditation and your meditation experience, it made me think about the importance of being present in the space. So I think it works for us to be, it works as architects to be very aware not only about the process of design, but also of the experience of design, because we usually work a lot with intuition, but we don't have the time, or we don't have the chance to see if that design works properly. So I think we require to be like in a meditative state somehow in order to appreciate the full experience of architecture. And I think meditation is something that we all should do some time in order to really appreciate the atmosphere and the architectural experience, I think. So I wanted to talk about those 2 words because I think we usually take for granted many experiences that we have. We are not fully aware of where we are, with whom we are, what we are doing, pretty much in an automatic state. So I wanted to bring some words that were developed by Gerdot Bohm, who said that atmosphere is the mindful physical presence in space. So I always thought that definition of atmosphere as somehow an invitation to meditate while we are in space. I wanted to say that because I think meditation and architectural experience are pretty close one to each other. And well, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight.
I don't know if we have any more questions. We have again Michael Arbib in the audience, and I know that he read Sarah's book and that he would probably be interested in doing some questions also.
Thanks, Maria. I think what I'd like to do is, some sense, wait till I have my own presentation. And I think what's fascinating is that we share so much, the multi-sensory perception, the linkage of perception and action, the concern with affordances. And what I'd like to do when I have my own talk, rather than having a 1-hour talk now, is in a sense pick up on the dialogue between Eve and Sarah in terms of to what extent can the neuroscience enrich our appreciation of these ideas. But I also want to pick up the other thing is that speaking as a neuroscientist who is not and never will be an architect, but as a consumer of architecture, I'm interested in the dialogue going the other way as well. What's in it for the neuroscientist? My career, long before I turned professionally to architecture, was looking at visuomotor and sensory motor coordination in frogs and rats and monkeys as well as humans. And so for me, part of the fascination of this conversation is what can one bring back to neuroscience by saying, okay, you have all these very focused studies in the lab. What happens as you move out of the lab and face that challenge of thinking about the questions of interacting with the real world, where there are so many variables and where each person is not constrained to just think about this very narrow topic in the scanner or whatever, but rather is responding in so many ways that we may or may not be aware of, whether we're architects or neuroscientists or the person themselves. So as I say, that I already spoke longer than I meant, but I think maybe this commercial for a coming attraction may be more to the point than saying any more right now, if that's okay with you.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for being here, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
Well, I think if there are no more questions, we can maybe wrap up. What do you think?
Yes, I would just ask our students again, because they are a little bit quiet. I think they need to process all the information. And
I actually have a question, if that's all right with you.
yes.
Yeah.
And I hope that doesn't, that the answer is not going to take too long for you, Sarah. But while you were talking and discussing with everyone, I was just wondering from your point of view, do you think that there always should be kind of like a sense of wonder to architecture? Because we were talking a lot of kind of like scientific stuff and how our brain perceives certain things and how we react and respond to everything. But do you think from a philosophical point of view that we as architects need to like hold on to this kind of like, I call it wonder, but to this thing that we can't quite explain, that makes like a space or a building or anything really something special to each and every one of us?
Yeah, I think absolutely, because we're never going to be able to explain everything. It's you know, because I mean, we're dynamic creatures in a dynamic world that's always changing. So there's no end to what's amazing and wondrous. And I think, you know, researching, for example, these like the desert thermocultural devices. These are wonderful. There's so much detail. They have been so honed over generations of people inhabiting and building and their local ecologies. And if you think about just vernacular architecture, it's all texture. There's so much texture, and mostly because, you know, it's handmade, these natural materials that are adapted to the local conditions in every possible way. So already they're inviting life in, and where life is invited in, it's going to grow. It's going to grow into moss. It's going to grow into lichens. It's going to create dust. It's going to make amazing shadow and light patterns on uneven surfaces. So things made with more time. I mean, all of those situations, time wasn't a commodity. You know, time was just something else. It's not how we think about it now. So time spent, you know, people work with their hands. People used to knit. People used to chisel. I mean, you know, there were like people. My point is, buildings should absolutely be wonderful, causing, you know, full of wonder. And I think the more they invite in life by being textured, by being made by hand, even if not maybe possible in our industrialized world, but you can have, you know, parts made by hand, something historical, something living that's changing all the time, instead of, you know, the basic, you know, problem I started with is that buildings don't breathe. They don't breathe because they don't have any breathing. There's nothing porous. They're hermetically sealed. So they're, you know, they're not wonderful. So.
Well, Sarah, thank you for this wonderful conversation. which we really took almost double of the time we had scheduled, but it was wonderful to have this conversation with you in this calm and very spacious, wonderful rhythm. Thank you so much, Sarah.
My pleasure. It was fun. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye. Thank you, everyone, for being
Bye.
here.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.